So this module is this is the final module of the course, and I'll give a brief introduction to verb semantics and lexical semantics. This is the kind of thing didn't go into in great detail in the previous modules, but it would be nice to just look at some of the basic properties here, so to give people a taste of the kind of things that you are likely to encounter if you look at a variety of things, a variety of phenomena in linguistic semantics. Now, a theory of verb meaning is important because verbs are usually the organizational core of a sentence with participants and event structure. But which parts of their meaning are lexical, semantic, or linguistic, and which parts are encyclopedic? Okay, so this is a decision we have to make. Remember that when we judge the truth values of sentences, we not only use aspects of the meaning of the individual components that compose a sentence, but also we have what might be called a knowledge of the world that's frequently described as encyclopedic knowledge. How much of the interpretation of a verb is a result of the semantic information from the lexicon, and how much comes from the outside? In pursuing this goal, a clear separation of real-world information and contextual inferencing from abstract semantic relations has to be maintained. The debate in the domain of verb meaning is between two polar approaches to verb meaning. The maximalist strategy tries to put as much semantics into the lexicon as possible and therefore assumes very rich semantic characterizations of verbs. In contrast, the minimalist approach limits the abstract semantics of the verbs in the lexicon and attributes more to contextual modification of the interpretation. Let's look at the first phenomena having to do with the semantics of verbs. We call this inner aspect, classification by event structure. As verbs inherently describe situations, a good way of understanding verb classes and verb meaning is through the kind of situation that they encode. Some describe what are called states, and others describe processes and events, the most basic as factual distinction. What are stative verbs? A sentence which describes a situation that is static or unchanging for its duration is called a state, like the following: Kumbhakarna loves food. Kumbhakarna knows cooking. A state does not seem to have any internal structure because no information ever describes the internal structure or phases of a state in a sentence. A state just holds of a certain type. Adjectives are typically used for expressing states. So if I say Kumbhakarna is fat, Kumbhakarna is angry, and so on. But there are a number of stative verbs like be, have, know, love, stay. These adjectives and verbs are inherently static in their lexical semantics. Stative verbs have some grammatical differences from dynamic verbs. The progressive cannot be used with stative verbs, but non-stative verbs can take the progressive. So, in native English, it is grammatical to say Kumbhakarna is learning Hindi, but it is ungrammatical to say Kumbhakarna is knowing German. The progressive aspect characterizes dynamism, which is unavailable with a stative. Statives also are bad in imperatives. So it's okay to say learn Hindi, but it is strange to say know Telugu. You can say learn Telugu, that's fine, but not know Telugu. These diagnostics for stativity do not always pattern the same. Some verbs behave like statives with one of them and non-statives with the other. So Kumbhakarna was remaining asleep in spite of all the noise is ungrammatical. Remain in your seats as an imperative is fine. Also, some verbs have stative as well as non-stative interpretations. Kumbhakarna has a beautiful chariot, a grammatical sentence. Kumbhakarna is having a beautiful chariot. Ungrammatical sentence. Kumbhakarna is having a lot of trouble dieting. Good sentence. Kumbhakarna is having an ice cream. Is also a good sentence. So here we have the verb have, which depending on various other properties of the sentence can either be interpreted in a stative or a non-stative manner. Dynamic verbs. Verbs which describe situations with a structure of change are called dynamic verbs. They imply action, and this has internal temporal structure, a beginning, a middle, and an end, called lexical aspect or Aktionsart, German terminology, to which various linguistic properties are sensitive. Dynamic verbs can be divided into two aspectual axes, duration and endpoint, into various subclasses based on their temporal contour, durative punctual nature, and telic or atelic nature. Durative verbs. Durative verbs describe those events which take time. These can be further subdivided into activities and accomplishments. Activities. Verbs that describe events that take time but have no inherent endpoint are called activities, and they can go on indefinitely, barring real-world limitations. Kumbhakarna slept, Kumbhakarna ran, and so on. These are also called unbounded or atelic verbs. They can be modified by the phrase for an hour, but not by the phrase in an hour, keeping aside the time taken for the activity to begin interpretation and thus concentrating on the duration of the event interpretation. So it's grammatical to say Kumbhakarna slept for an hour, but it's ungrammatical to say Kumbhakarna slept in an hour. Accomplishments. Verbs which describe events that take time and have an inherent endpoint are called accomplishments. The endpoint or telos produces a result state. Kumbhakarna built the fort. Kumbhakarna cleaned his chariot. These are a kind of bounded or telic verbs. They can be modified by the phrase for an hour and also by the phrase in an hour. Kumbhakarna built the fort in an hour. Kumbhakarna built the fort for an hour. Punctual verbs. Punctual verbs describe an event that seems so instantaneous that it does not take any time. The linguistic system is not sensitive to their internal structure. These can be further subdivided into semelfactives and achievements. Semelfactives are atelic punctual verbs without an endpoint. Kumbhakarna hopped, Kumbhakarna winked. They also have the property of being iterated easily. Achievements are telic punctual verbs with a transition to a result state. Kumbhakarna broke the mace. Kumbhakarna arrived at the battlefield. Kumbhakarna noticed the food. They cannot be modified by the phrase for an hour, but they can be modified by the phrase in an hour. Kumbhakarna broke the mace in a minute. It's a grammatical sentence. Kumbhakarna broke the mace for a minute is a non-grammatical sentence. It is possible to describe a feature breakdown of a spectral classes in the following way. This follows the work of the linguist Olson, which has the following makeup. You have dynamic, durative, telic predicates. There are a variety of properties that these predicates have that they get plus or minus values for. And these are whether they're a temporary state or a permanent state, whether they're activity or accomplishment, whether they're achievement, semelfactive, and so on. You see the pluses and minuses in the chart that you will see right now. Now, the semantics of verbs can also be classified by their participles. These are called semantic roles. If a verb's meaning determines its argument realization choices, examining verbs with shared or overlapping features Overlapping patterns of argument structure provides a way of identifying the linguistic components of the core of these verbs. Verbs assign semantic roles to other parts of the sentence that are participants in the situation described by the verb. These are called thematic roles. A list of basic thematic roles are the following. Agent, the initiator of some action capable of acting with volition. When Kumbhakarna ate the sambar, Kumbhakarna is the agent. Patient, the entity undergoing the effect of some action, often undergoing some change of state. Kumbhakarna broke the bed. The bed is the patient. It is affected by the act of breaking. Theme. A theme is that entity which is moved by an action or whose location is described. Kumbhakarna shot the arrow. The arrow is the theme. Experiencer, the entity which is aware of the action or state described by the predicate, but which is not in control of the action or state. Kumbhakarna saw the feast. Kumbhakarna here is the experiencer of the event of seeing. Beneficiary, the entity for whose benefit the action was performed. Kumbhakarna fought for his brother. His brother is the beneficiary in this sentence. Instrument, the means by which an action is performed or something comes about. Kumbhakarna wrote him memoirs with a quill. With a quill is the instrument. Goal, the entity towards which something moves, either literally or metaphorically. If I say Kumbhakarna walked to the palace is the goal. Source, the entity from which something moves, either literally or metaphorically. The monkeys ran from Kumbhakarna. From Kumbhakarna here is the source. Chomsky, 1981, the Lectures on Government and Binding, proposed what became known as the theta criterion, that there must be a one-to-one correspondence between noun phrases and thematic rules. Jackendorf, 1990, built the idea that one participant can fulfill more than one role in a sentence into a theory of tiers of thematic roles. So his proposal was the following. You have action tier roles. These are actor, agent, experiencer, patient, beneficiary, instrument, and so on, and what he called thematic tier roles. Theme, goal, source, location, and so on. There's a particular mapping between grammatical relations and thematic roles. For example, there's a subject hierarchy of which theta role can be in this position. Agent is typically higher than recipient or beneficiary, which is higher than theme or patient, which is higher than instrumental, which is higher than the instrument, which is higher than the location, and so on. A language that allows a subject at one position on the hierarchy also allows a subject anywhere to the left on the hierarchy. Verbs have particular requirements for their thematic roles, and the lexicon specifies thematic roles associated with the argument of a verb. This listing of thematic roles is called the thematic role grid or the theta grid. For example, the theta grid or the thematic role grid of the verb put is what you see there between angled brackets, agent, theme, location. Listing thematic grids shows that verbs form classes which share the same grids. For example, English has the class or transfer of giving verbs, which include give, lend, supply, pay, donate, contribute, and so on. They have the following thematic grid: agent, theme, recipient. Another subclass encodes the transfer from the perspective of the recipient. These verbs include receive, accept, borrow, buy, purchase, rent. Higher, they have the following thematic grid: recipient, theme, source. What is the semantic basis for characterizing semantic rules? In a very influential paper, Doughty, 1991, proposed The thematic roles are not semantic primitives, but instead are themselves defined in terms of entailments. A theta role is a cluster of entailments about an argument position which are shared by a group of verbs. Understanding thematic roles in terms of clusters of entailments also solves the problem of variation and fuzziness in defining a thematic role that various authors have struggled with. Doughty proposes that they should not be viewed as discrete and bounded categories, but instead as prototypes with different degrees of membership. He proposes that there are essentially only two types of prototypes: the agent proto-role and the patient proto-role. The agent proto-role consists of volitional involvement in the event state, sentience and or perception, causing an event or change of state in another participant, movement relative to the position of another participant. Patient proto-roles are the following: undergo a change of state, incremental theme, causally affected by another participant, stationary relative to the movement of another participant, and so on. Some arguments show more of the entailments than others. The motivation for identifying thematic roles is to characterize the link between semantic classification of participants and grammatical relations that a verb supports. So Doughty proposes the following principles to achieve this. Number one, the argument selection principle. In predicates with grammatical subject and object, the argument for which the predicate entails the greatest number of proto-agent properties will be lexicalized as the subject of the predicate. The argument having the greatest number of proto-patient entailments will be lexicalized as the direct object, and so on. Corollary 1 of this principle is the following: if two arguments of a relation have approximately equal numbers of entailed proto-agent and proto-patient properties, then either or both may be lexicalized as the subject, and similarly for objects. Corollary 2. With a three-place predicate, the non-subject argument having the greater number of proto-patient properties will be lexicalized as the direct object, and the non-subject argument having fewer entailed proto-patient properties will be lexicalized as an oblique or prepositional object. And if two non-subject arguments have approximately equal numbers of entailed p-patient properties, either or both may be lexicalized as the direct object. The second principle is non-discreteness. Proto-roles obviously do not classify arguments exhaustively. Some arguments have neither role, or uniquely. Some arguments may share the same role, or discretely. Some arguments could qualify partially but not equally for both proto-roles. Besides acting as a crucial explanatory link between semantic and syntactic argument structure, thematic roles help in characterizing semantic verb classes. For example, there are two subclasses of psychological verbs in English, both of which take two arguments, experiencer and stimulus, but in the opposite order, with one choosing experiencer as subject and the other as stimulus as subject. Psychological verb type 1, experiencer, stimulus. Examples of this are admire, enjoy, fear, like, love, relish, savor, and so on. Psychological verb type 2, stimulus, experiencer. Examples of this being amuse, entertain, frighten, scare, interest, please, surprise, thrill, and so on. Such classifications of verbs also help determine which grammatical processes a particular verb can or cannot undergo. A large number of verb alternations have been identified in English by Levin 1993, and the conditioning factors for them have proven to be a mix of semantic information like the theta grid and the grammatical structure. Classification by conceptual structure. Ramchand, this is sometimes often called first phase syntax / semantics. Ramchand 2008 decomposes verbs into three distinct heads, each corresponding to a primitive element of the events. The internal structure of the verb phrase contains the following three sub-event projections: init P, init for initiation; proc P, proc for process; res P, res for result. The first, init, and the third, res, are stative heads, while the second, proc, is the hallmark of dynamicity. The first, init, and the third, res, are stative heads, while the second, proc, is the hallmark of dynamicity. Every dynamic verb then contains the proc head in its decomposition. The stative head init and res heads, however, can be missing in the case of dynamic verbs. Each sub-event head enters in a predicational relation with its specifier position, where we find the subject of the event. Init P introduces the causation event and licenses the external argument, the initiator. Proc P specifies the process or the nature of the change and licenses the internal argument, the undergoer. Res P introduces the result state and licenses the holder of the result state, the resultee. The maximal decomposition of the verb phrase is given below. You have init P, which goes to initiator, and then another node that goes to proc P and init, which goes to undergoer, which goes to res P and proc. Res P has a specifier resultee, then rem, res, and so on. In this model, verbs come in the lexicon with a categorical feature specification, which determines which sub-events they lexicalize. For example, a verb specified as init proc will spell out both the init and the proc head simultaneously. Depending on which sub-event heads a verb lexicalizes, it belongs to a particular verb class. Thus, there is the class of init proc verbs, the class of init proc res verbs, the class of proc res verbs, etc. If we are to connect these classes to the traditional spectral classes, then activities are characterized by the features init, proc, or only proc. Achievement verbs are specified as init proc res or proc res. Statives have only the feature init, etc. When it comes to argument structure, unergatives are verbs that are specified with the feature init, while unaccusatives lack this feature. Composite roles arise when the same DP argument occupies two or more specifier positions. This happens when the DP raises from the specifier of a lower sub-event to the specifier of a higher sub-event head. In such cases, we have the roles of initiator undergoer, undergoer resultee, and initiator undergoer resultee. The first one arises when the same argument is the holder of the initial stage, the initiational stage, and undergoes the process or change, for example, the sole argument of the verb run. The second one arises when the same argument undergoes the process change specified by the proc head and holds the result state, for example, the direct object of break. The third one arises when the same argument initiates the event, undergoes the process / change, and is the holder of the result state. For example, the argument of arrive. The composite thematic roles of the participants in the event are encoded in the lexical entry of the verb. That is, the verb determines whether a certain DP will raise from one specifier to another or not. An event head can have not only another sub-event phrase as its complement, but also non-verbal material. DP, AP, PP, etc., occupying its complement position, called reem. Reems are not the subjects of events, but part of the description of the predicate. A DP in the reem position builds one joint predication with the verb. A DP in the specifier position of a sub-event head is a verbal argument. What conclusions do we draw from all of this? There are various reasons for classifying verbs based on a spectral properties or semantic rules. It reflects their syntactic and semantic behavior, predicts a verb's participation in various alternations based on argument structure, and also helps in getting a handle on the morphological processes that verbs undergo based on these properties. It also helps in identifying the meaning components that form the semantics and syntax of verbs, as in the attempt in first phase syntax. Finally, this helps in the understanding of the subtle meaning components that play a role in determining the differences between closely related verbs. Now, there's a bunch of things that you might want to think about once you've gone through this basic introduction to the lexical semantics of verbs. For example, here is a set of problems that you might want to take a look at. Stative verbs normally cannot occur in the progressive aspect or in imperatives. Use these two diagnostics to test which of the following verbs are stative. Think, know, resemble, imitate, seem, prefer, dislike. Some verbs are ambiguous and have both a stative and a dynamic use. For each of the verbs below, give one example of a stative use and one example of a dynamic use. Use the test for stativity and dynamicity to distinguish between the two. Equal, reach, admire, smell, and so on.